Okay, today, ladies and gentlemen, we are taking a look at the differences and the similarities between feudalism in Japan and feudalism in Europe. So please make sure you have your note packet out and you are taking a look at page 10. All right, so 3 I can statements today. I can compare the similarities of feudal Europe to feudal Japan. So, what did they have in common? Number 2, contrast the differences between European and Japanese feudalism. So, again, what are the differences? What's different between the two types of feudalism? And finally, identify the legacies of feudalism in both Europe and Japan. So, what do we remember about feudalism in both of those societies? Okay, so let's start by looking at the similarities. So, first of all, we're looking at very similar structures. Again, feudalism was based on land, and the more land you owned, the more power you had. So, landowners were able to gain power. In Japan, we talked about that those landowners were called the daimyo or daimyo. You may hear it pronounced like that as well. In Europe, they are referred to as the lords or the nobles. In both Europe and Japan, farming drove the economy. Okay, so peasants worked the land, and then again, that is how they were able to survive through farming and then exchanging some of those goods. Both structures had warriors to defend the landowners. So we talked about the samurai in Japan, and then in Europe, they're known as the knights. They also had similar values. So, for example, both societies really put a lot of focus on military skill, bravery, and personal loyalty. Okay, notice the blank there. Warriors were expected to follow a certain code of behavior. So, for example, the samurai followed the code of Bushido. And that was kind of the laws, the way that they were supposed to act, and the way that they were supposed to treat people. Similarly, the knights also had their own code, and that was the code of chivalry. And that was the code that they had to follow. They also had quite a bit of differences between the two societies. So even though in both religion was something that was an important part to both knights and samurai, the actual religion practice was different. So knights of Europe were Christian. They practiced Christianity. Samurai, remember we talked about how they blended the Shinto religion, so Shintoism, along with a form of Buddhism known as Zen Buddhism. Okay. Likewise, in both of those societies, poetry flourished. So there was a lot of poetry going on, but there are different types of poetry. So in Japan, the main focus are haikus, so short poems about nature, while epic poems, long tales about warriors, legends, and myths spread throughout Europe. Also, the two different feudal structures place different emphasis on the roles of women. So in Europe, they had very limited roles. So they had no say in who they would marry. It was all arranged marriages, and they were expected to stay at home and kind of run the home. They were trained in household responsibilities such as sewing, weaving, and farming, basically everything that you need to do to run the home and to run the farm. Whereas in Japan, the women had equal status to the men. So they could receive inheritance, which means they didn't necessarily have to get married in order to have money, and they could join Buddhist convents as well, which means, again, they kind of got to choose basically their future, their path that they wanted to take. The other thing that they could do in Japan that women couldn't do in Europe was train in the martial arts. And there are even a few famous female samurai warriors that were trained to be samurai. Okay, now looking at some of the legacies in both feudal societies. In Europe, the surnames, the last names that we see today, many of them were based on medieval jobs. So back in the Middle Ages, you might have, if your first name is Bob, last name would be baker, cook, carpenter. Those are the professions that they had during the Middle Ages. But nowadays, those are common last names today that stemmed from medieval Europe. The other big legacy, something that's still around today, is the influence of the Catholic Church, so the religion of Christianity. It's still one of the most popular religions, and it has a powerful influence on the daily lives of the people that practice that religion. Same thing in Japan. Weddings nowadays, modern day times, are also based on Shinto ceremonies. Likewise, haikus, we see them all the time. It's still a very popular form of writing, popular form of poetry. And also this idea of having loyalty to your family that was strong during the feudal times, but also in Japan today. You put the family's needs above your own. Okay, so we've got 3 checkpoint questions, one for each I can statement. So the first one, compare the similarities of feudal Europe to feudal Japan. So notice I kind of started it for you. So one way that feudal Europe and feudal Japan are similar is that, fill in the blank. And then another way that they're similar is that, and fill in the blank. When you're ready, move on to the next one. Checkpoint number 11. Contrast the differences between European and Japanese feudalism. So remember, if you tell me something about one side, you need to tell me how it's different from the other. So in Europe, they had what versus in Japan, they had what? Give me 2 different examples. And finally, checkpoint number 12. Identify the legacies of feudalism in both Europe and Japan. So one concept still around from feudal Europe is what? And then another concept that's still around today from feudal Europe is what? And then same thing for feudal Japan. So one concept still around from feudal Japan is, fill in the rest of that. And another concept still around from feudal Japan is, give me the second point. Okay. Please make sure you've filled in all the blanks. Make sure you've answered all the questions.